Health First Aid. My name is Trina Lukoff. Today we are joined by Dr. Joann Wright, Linden Oaks Medical Group clinical psychologist. Thank you, Joann, for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, thank you.
So if you could tell us a little bit about your role at Linden Oaks Medical Group and kind of what services you offer. And then our topic for today is going to be discussing hoarding, some of the causes, symptoms, and how to help maybe a loved one who might be struggling with some hoarding capabilities.
Yeah, sure. So at Linden Oaks Medical Group, I'm a clinical psychologist serving people in the community with a variety of mental health issues. I typically focus on folks with anxiety disorders, but I see people with many types of disorders that they come to the clinic with, including OCD, and I've treated people who hoard in the clinic as well.
I know it's a very interesting topic, and people don't really understand kind of the science behind it, the causes and the symptoms. Let's specifically talk about maybe what some of the causes would be to have hoarding capabilities or the disorder.
Sure, and sometimes they start very simply. For example, I've treated a number of people who started because they wanted to save, say, their baby clothes, you know, their first child's baby clothes, because they're planning on having a second child. And so, well, these really are going to be useful because they're going to be hand-me-downs. But then they realize that by the time that their children are now teenagers, they don't need the baby clothes any longer, and they're having a tough time getting rid of them. And they're realizing that they have some attachment to them. Another piece that happens very frequently is hoarding begins after a traumatic experience, the loss of a loved one, maybe a home fire, something that was very traumatic, where loss was a big piece of it. And as you might be able to imagine, hoarding is a way of regaining control. You can't take this away from me. I might need this in the future. This is important to me. And next thing you know, their house is completely filled with objects that are not useful any longer, to the point sometimes that there are, you know, rat or insect infestations, and they can't have company over. They're embarrassed by the situation, and they have lost, actually, through their trying to control, not losing things, they've actually lost quite a bit in their life.
But they think they've got control over this, and what would their loved ones kind of be, how would their loved ones be impacted by this kind of behavior, or what they would start to notice initially?
A lot of times hoarders stop having people over to their home because they know it's a problem, they know it's embarrassing. If hoarding has gotten to an extreme, people can't even navigate through the house, and they don't want anybody to see that. So the first symptom that you start seeing is, oh, I'm sorry, I can't have you over. I know you're in town and I haven't seen you for 2 years, but you just can't come over to the house. I will meet you out and have coffee. And all of a sudden you realize, year after year, they have moved away from you being able to come visit them. That could be friends, loved ones, anyone. Fewer and fewer people are allowed access to the home because the home is in such bad shape.
Would typically an individual who has hoarding, has an issue with hoarding, they would still have, you know, a social aspect to their lives, it would just be removed from their home?
It starts collapsing because they are less willing to meet people out because they're kind of afraid of those connections. So here again is that they wanted to gain control by keeping things that can't be taken away from them, and actually they're losing control. Their social life is collapsing, perhaps their educational life or their career is also collapsing because the hoarding starts taking over more and more of their life.
Okay, interesting, very interesting. As an individual who, you know, could be, you talked a little bit about some of the reasons for hoarding, and are there any risk factors that somebody should be aware of that would have them more likely to be hoarding?
Well, you know, as far as risk factors go in their daily life as a hoarder, I mean, there's safety issues involved. First of all, it's very unsafe. Sometimes people have so much stuff that it can literally collapse on them. There are germ issues. There are, again, you know, rat and insect infestations that often happen in the house. You sometimes see, you know, refrigerators and countertops filled with food that would now be poisonous. The quality of the air goes down. As far as risk factors, mental health-wise, some of the risk factors would be a propensity toward OCD, toward anxiety disorders. ADHD are often co-occurring disorders, because if you can imagine, not being able to organize your mind could lead to the beginnings of hoarding.
You mentioned a little bit about anxiety and depression, how they coexist, and you also mentioned OCD. So can you talk a little bit about OCD and hoarding behaviors?
Sure. OCD and hoarding can sometimes be conceptualized as the same disorder. It is the inability to stop doing a behavior even though it's not helpful in your life, that you feel like you're gaining control through behaviors that get in the way of your life. For example, let's say, comparing it to someone who washes their hands 150 times a day. That's not helpful to them moving forward. It's a hindrance holding them back from the life that they want to lead, because that's getting in the way of their doing things. They're not social because they're afraid of shaking hands with people or being in contact with people. Hoarding operates in a very similar way, in that the obsession with keeping things and somehow, navigating through a house that's completely filled with unuseful objects will get in the way of them moving forward in their life.
Very interesting. We need to take a short break, and we'll come back to discuss a little bit more. Thank you for joining us.
Caring for a family member can be challenging and lead to countless questions for them and for you. Find articles, tips, and tools from experts and others who have been in your place. The Caregiving Resource Center at aarp.org/caregiving.
Let me tell you about the toughest guy on earth. He does the work of 2 jobs, but only gets paid for one. Caregiving is tougher than tough. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back to Mental Health First Aid. We're again joined by Dr. Joann Wright. We're talking about hoarding, and we're going to kind of dive a little bit more into talking about hoarding versus collecting, because many of us like to hold on to items. You mentioned the baby clothes and maybe holding on to them until the birth of your next child.
Right.
But then now this child is a teenager, and the items not only have increased, but you've added to them. So can you talk a little bit about what other items people would kind of start to collect that have no relative meaning to anybody around them?
And we collect in many different ways. We collect, family heirlooms. We collect, love letters from loved ones. And if they're contained, they're not interfering in our life. They're easily stored. And I will talk for a second about my sister. My sister has a beautiful collection of Hummel figures. They have a lovely case. She has hundreds of them, but they're well kept. They're not taking over her home. People enjoy them when they come over to visit her. That would not be hoarding. That would be collecting. Hoarding is when you hang on to things that have no value any longer, but you fear that they might be useful if you get rid of them. For example, in a hoarder's home, you might see an entire room that's stacked with magazines. Those magazines might go back to 1972. And they're afraid that there might be a useful piece of information within that magazine. If I get rid of that, that might have an article that I'm later going to need. And yet they haven't touched that pile of magazines for years and years and perhaps decades. But they're so afraid that if they get rid of them, they might later be useful.
And they might have significant anxiety about not being able to locate an item.
That's right. That's right.
They probably know. Do hoarders know what they have in their home, or is it cataloged in their brain?
That's a wonderful question, and yes, it's cataloged in their brain, and often it's not cataloged anywhere else because they have so much stuff. But if you were to ask them, where are your dog toys from your dog that passed away 10 years ago, they would be able to climb over mountains of items and say they're right here.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Now, somebody who can function like that at home in this chaos of this hoarding, can they have a normal, work experience? Do they effectively go to work?
Some folks do. Some folks, once they leave the house, they function perfectly fine. And there are people who have no idea that they're a hoarder at home. And you and I were talking on the break about people, like how it expands out. There are people who have several storage units. They might have their shed in their backyard completely filled with things. I worked with somebody once who had styrofoam cups, an entire shed filled with styrofoam cups, because they somehow might need these cups someday in their life, and so they're afraid to get rid of them. There are also people who might even buy a second home to keep more things if they can afford that. Unfortunately, what happens sometimes is these structures decompose because they're so filled, they become filled with mold and mildew, and the structure becomes bad, and a lot of times the homes have to be demolished.
Because they're not safe to live in.
They're not safe to live in.
What would a person, what would be the first step in getting somebody some help that maybe you know, I have a loved one that is struggling. I've noticed some tendencies that are alarming to me, and I want to get them help because they're obviously struggling with something. How would you go about getting that person help, or how would you approach that person to lessen their embarrassment about the situation?
So you want to look for somebody who specializes in hoarding or at least OCD, because the first course of treatment we want is exposure and response prevention. Now that is really, really difficult to do with hoarders. With sort of generalized OCD, it's a little bit easier. Now we use acceptance and commitment therapy, and what that adds to the exposure and response prevention is committed action and values. And the reason that we want to do that is it's like, let's say for example, someone hasn't had their own daughter over to their home for several years because they know what the daughter's going to say. They know they're going to say, Mom, you can't live this way any longer. We've got to do something about this. And they don't want to hear it, and they're also extremely embarrassed. There's a lot of guilt and shame around hoarding behavior. And so when we add that value, like in service of your value of your relationship with your daughter, are you willing to start working toward getting rid of things? Also, a lot of therapists who work with hoarders do it in vivo. That is to say, they go to the home. Because when they start getting very anxious and sometimes a panic attack around the idea of throwing away, you know, they might have 300 coffee mugs. It's like, which ones are you willing to part with? And they can sit with them while they go through the anxiety and panic of choosing those, and they're right there with them. And so exposure and response prevention, acceptance and commitment therapy, and in vivo together has the highest possibility of getting this person true help and getting them to change.
So potentially someone could be in their home helping them through kind of de-hoarding their house. What kind of, how much of a time frame would it take for somebody to sit at a table with all these coffee mugs surrounding them to determine which one they wanted to keep, and how difficult could that process be for them?
It really depends from person to person. Their willingness to change is really kind of connected to the values. I'm going to give you a little kind of a weird example. And like if let's say I had a push pin in my hand, and I were to say, Trina, can I push this push pin right into the middle of your palm? Would you mind if I did that?
Not right now.
No, right? No, probably not ever. That wouldn't be a very good idea.
Put a pin in it, because we're going to come back in a second and we'll talk about that in a second. Thank you.
Caring for a family member can be challenging and lead to countless questions for them and for you. Find articles, tips, and tools from experts and others who have been in your place. The Caregiving Resource Center at aarp.org/caregiving.
Let me tell you about the toughest guy on earth. He does the work of 2 jobs, but only gets paid for one. Caregiving is tougher than tough. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Bye, Janet. It's nice seeing you again. You look good, girl. Just let me know what I can do to help.
Well, to help me, she'd have to help every day. Every hour, every ouch, every time my wife calls for help. I mean, maybe she could help me make her lunch, but the crust, all the crust has to be cut off the corners. She could help me run to the doctor for the 5th time this week. Help me with the specialist and the second opinions and the painful paperwork about paperwork. Help me deal with how hard it is seeing my wife's name on so much paperwork. But this is on me. I'm the only one who can do this, like this, for her. Besides,
Take care.
we will. Janet doesn't like her cooking anyway.
Find support for your strength. Visit aarp.org/caregiving for care guides and community.
Welcome back to Mental Health First Aid. We're again joined by Dr. Joann Wright. We're talking a little bit about hoarding, and we spoke a little bit about like how difficult it would be for an individual to sit around a table having to decide which items to get rid of. And we talked about a pin, so let's continue.
I was just getting ready to stab you with a pin.
Yes, and I said no, thank you.
And so that is what we do a lot of times as therapists. We don't give the person the why should I do this. We give them the how. Like, this is how you can do it, but we don't give them the why. And so if I were just to say, I'm going to stick this pin in your hand for no good reason, you wouldn't want to. But if I were to say, I'm going to stick this pin in your hand and your life is going to change toward the way you want it to look, now are you going to take it?
I'd say yes.
Yes, I'll endure that pain for the life that I want to live. And so talking about the values that the person has in their life that have been eliminated because of their hoarding. Again, you know, I haven't seen my daughter in 2 years because I won't have her over to the house, and there's nowhere else for us to visit because she lives out of town. I have lost touch with my friends for the same reasons. I come home from work at the end of the day and I don't have a place to cook nutritious food because my countertops are filled, you know, with food that's been there for 3 and 4 weeks because I won't get rid of it. I have rats all over the place. It's hard for me to get ready for work. All of these things that are important to the person that they've given up in the name of hoarding.
Because their stuff is more important to really how they're feeling.
They have gotten to that place that their stuff has become more important, exactly right. And so how do we turn that around now and say, okay, you have a choice here. If you want to spend time with your daughter who you haven't seen in 2 years, is that worth, here's the push pin part, getting rid of these mugs?
Right.
Is it worth getting rid of the rotten food on the counters so we don't have a rat-infested home any longer?
Right. So you mentioned like the daughter in the last segment, and as a mental health first aider, one of the things that we teach individuals about being a good first aider is you're not there to fix the problem, you're there to offer comfort and support.
Right.
So for a daughter to approach her mom to talk to her about her hoarding capabilities, what would be a good thing for that daughter to say? Like, I know that we talk about not being judgmental, and there's probably many judgments that go around people who hoard, but how would somebody approach somebody to kind of talk to them about their tendencies?
I'm talking about what you've noticed. I've noticed some changes in your life. Some of the changes that I've noticed is, you haven't had me over for a while, and it seems like every time I come to town, you know, there's reasons that you give me for me not being able to come over, but I'd sure like to be able to spend time with you in your home when I'm here.
Oh my gosh.
Other things that they might say is, I've also noticed that every time you and I are together when I am in town, we go to thrift shops and you just buy a lot of stuff, and I'm having a hard time figuring out what's the meaning of this stuff that you're buying. And so maybe that's something we can look into. And while we do that, you know, I've looked into a couple of psychologists and counselors who I think might be able to help you with this.
I think it's very important what you said about, like, you know, I've noticed, because when you put a you in front of something, when you're talking to an individual, it automatically puts them on the defensive. So when you approach a topic with I'm noticing, I'm concerned, I'm here for you, how can I be helpful? I mean, I imagine that would allow the door to be opened a little bit for a conversation to happen with an individual.
And I think that's true anytime you've noticed major changes in a friend or a loved one, to say, I'm just noticing this and it's giving me pause. And I just want to know more about what's going on for you. I love you. I'm here for you. If there's anything I can do that can help you. You know, but to your point, if you start with you know, you never let me come over, you go buy a bunch of junk every time we're together, what's going on? Immediately on the defense, it's like, I'm fine. I don't know what you're talking about.
Right, exactly. When you do all these different treatments, approaches to an individual, can an individual successfully recover from their hoarding? And what's the potential for relapse, and how would we kind of watch out for the warning signs?
The relapse is if the person has successfully recovered from hoarding, the relapse rate is quite low. Some people don't get there though. Some people are just highly resistant and they just don't want to change. I shouldn't say just don't want to change. I think they want very badly to change. They can't come into contact with the mechanisms on how to do that, even if they have a really skilled therapist who knows all of the best ways of helping somebody through empirically imported treatments, and the person is just unwilling. That's the hardest piece, working with the unwillingness, getting them to a place, and then that's through trying to connect them with values of friends, career, loved ones, family members, etc. Of wouldn't things be closer to the way you'd like your life to look if we reduced your mugs from 300 to 10.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to need to take a short break, so we'll be back in just a few minutes. Thank you.
Caring for a family member can be challenging and lead to countless questions for them and for you. Find articles, tips, and tools from experts and others who have been in your place. The Caregiving Resource Center at aarp.org/caregiving.
Let me tell you about the toughest guy on earth. He does the work of 2 jobs, but only gets paid for 1. Caregiving is tougher than tough. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back to Mental Health First Aid. We're again joined by Dr. Joann Wright. We're going to continue on our conversation about hoarding. Specifically, we talked during the break about kind of clutter versus hoarding, because I know many of us have piles in our home that we have to have those piles there regardless of how many times we touch those piles during the week. But what is that, clutter versus hoarding? What does that look like?
Sure, and so I have to admit I'm a bit guilty of this myself, whereas, my drawers, like for example, my utensils in my kitchen and where we keep our mugs and our water bottles and all of that, they can get really piled up. And sometimes that's just we don't have time to pay attention to it. If you are mindful of it and you stay on top of it, maybe not, all throughout the week, but maybe once or twice a year you go through and you cull things that you don't need and you keep on top of it, you are not in danger of being a hoarder. You can have clutter throughout your house, like you were saying, piles of paper. I know in my home office, I don't go through it as often as I should, and it might get a little bit high before I go in and file things. That's not somebody who's headed toward being a hoarder. Hoarding really is when you feel a tremendous anxiety about getting rid of anything after it's lost its usefulness in your life. And again, if we were talking about over the break how people give you water bottles and coffee mugs for Christmas presents and holiday gifts, and next thing you know, you're like, oh my gosh, what am I doing with all this stuff? And you are fine getting rid of them and going through them, and maybe going through clothes and things and giving them to Goodwill. Someone who is a hoarder has the inability to do that.
They probably don't, like the clutter, it's more about finding the time to do it. You
Right.
open that cupboard and you
Right.
see all these mugs and you're like, ugh, I can't deal with it. I don't want to look at it. It's not that I don't want to get rid of it. For somebody who's hoarding and opens that cupboard and sees all these mugs, the anxiety that it produces to and they may have the time to do it, but the anxiety created behind
Getting
the
rid of
act.
something useful. And they might have, I should say, a very distorted idea of what's useful. For example, I was talking about early on about somebody who, keeps the baby clothes because they're going to use them as hand-me-downs. So all of a sudden it's like, oh gosh, I don't have any more kids, and these are, for 2T, and they're all in their teenage years now. And so then if that person just recognized that and said, oh, I don't need these baby clothes anymore, gives them to Goodwill, dumps them, whatever they decide to do with them, they have no problem around that. But when they start feeling that anxiety, now you've got that twinge of OCD and hoarding that comes up with that anxiety. Why are you anxious about getting rid of it? What's underneath that?
So for somebody who's trying to be helpful and you have a family member that might be hoarding, taking away those items could have a devastating effect.
Absolutely.
Like without their knowledge, going
Absolutely.
in and kind of removing items.
And that has happened, and it can have devastating effects, and it's really never a good idea for a therapist, for a family member, for anyone to decide to go in and do it for them, because they are doing this to try to grasp on to control, and it's as if you just took total control away from them. We want to help them understand how this desire for control is working against them, and they're losing control by trying to keep and gain control, because so many aspects of their life are just collapsing around them. And so their desire to gain control is resulting in them losing control in many, many aspects of their life, but it's certainly not for somebody else to come in and figure out how that gets rolled out.
Can it be seen as a coping mechanism in some, like an individual who might be hoarding or holding on to something, some type of coping mechanism, and almost like taking that coping mechanism away,
Right.
although it's not a healthy one for this individual
Right.
at this moment in time, taking that mechanism away could be devastating to them.
And you can think about all of the unhealthy and unhelpful coping strategies humans can come up with, whether it be an eating disorder, drinking, drugging. I mean, there's just many, many ways that people use unhealthy coping strategies, and you don't go in and just take it away from them. You don't walk into somebody's house who may be an alcoholic and grab all the booze out and say, you're done, you're not drinking anymore. That would just be too much, and it's not in their control then how to work toward a healthier life.
So what would be the first step if you were to approach an individual, a parent, a loved one, and you've voiced all of your concerns? What would be the first step for a person to take in order to get help? At perhaps like a therapist or a Linden Oaks, what would be the first step? Would they just go right into a therapist, or would they go in for some type of assessment with their doctor? What would be the first step that they should take?
An assessment is always a good idea, not only to be certain that this is true hoarding, but also to see what level they're at in their hoarding, because the course of treatment is going to be different for someone who's very new to hoarding and is just starting to move into hoarding, or somebody who's been hoarding for decades. And so we'd need to tailor our treatment around that. You'd want somebody who has a good handle on treating at least OCD and at best hoarding specifically.
So there are specific individuals who kind of specialize in that.
Yes.
And perhaps going to your doctor is always the first place to start, because you can kind of identify some signs and symptoms that you might be exhibiting, but also kind of seeking treatment at a therapist or a mental health facility to kind of get some treatment as well.
That's right.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a very interesting topic.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining us for Mental Health First Aid. We look forward to serving your needs again. Thank you.
Caring for a family member can be challenging and lead to countless questions for them and for you. Find articles, tips, and tools from experts and others who have been in your place. The Caregiving Resource Center at aarp.org/caregiving.
Let me tell you about the toughest guy on earth. He does the work of 2 jobs, but only gets paid for one. Caregiving is tougher than tough. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.